of Foreign Affairs in the margins of the United Nations General Assembly. It was co-chaired by Honorable Dr. Vince Henderson, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dominica. The resulting communique pledged to embark on training of CARICOM diplomats, collaboration with the Caribbean community in a series of events of mutual interest, especially to securing peace and security. In this regard, Diplomats Without Borders has been, in the case of other regions of the world, committed to providing the services of its experienced and impartial former diplomats pro bono, supported by relevant experts to strengthen conflict prevention and resolution capabilities, offer advice and training, and provide a platform for dialogue in the Caribbean. This is the context in which the Board of Diplomats Without Borders gave its approval for the Latin America group to collaborate with the Caribbean Policy Consortium, chaired by Dr. David Lewis, to present this inaugural webinar on US deportations and their impact on the Caribbean as part of a series. It is therefore my great pleasure to welcome you all and extend best wishes for a successful dialogue.
Thank you very much, Eddie, for those introductory remarks. And I myself, I'm honored to be speaking in place of Dr. David Lewis, the chair of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and a founding fellow. David was unfortunately called away at the last minute to attend to an urgent business matter. But I am also, in addition to being a member of the Diplomats Without Borders, a fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. So I'm wearing two hats today, and I'll try not to be too schizophrenic about it. I'd just like to say a few words about CPC. It's a virtual think tank of experts in the Caribbean, focused mainly on US Caribbean engagement, but also dealing with issues of high importance to our region. We have experts drawn from the Caribbean, of course, but also based in North America, and they represent academia, civil society, and are also practitioners, former diplomats like myself, and people from the private sector too. We value this collaboration with DWB. There's an obvious convergence of interests, and we think that the series of webinars on which we're about to embark has particular relevance to the region. Obviously, we're beginning with US deportations and their impact in the Caribbean. The next webinar in early April will focus on Haiti and a discussion on possibilities for the way forward there. And then the third webinar will be on multilateralism, the challenges facing the multilateral system and the notion that international organizations are under siege. And again, we'll try to come up with recommendations on what might be done. We will provide more information on those webinars and their dates and the panelists in due course. But we're hoping that with the virtual audience gathered here today, the word will go out that this really is a series worthy of attention. It'll engage our policymakers as well as our thinkers in the region, and we can share something very worthwhile with our regional community. Without further ado, I just wanted to say that I'm delighted that on the panel, and they will be properly introduced by Professor Jessica Byron Reed, but Professor Ivelaw Griffith is also a founding member of CPC, and Dr. Byron Reed is herself a fellow of CPC. Ms. Roberta Clark, the member of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, is a member of DWB, and Dr. Natalie Dietrich Jones. We look forward to your presentation because we think that at some point you may well find yourself sitting in one of our groups. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today, and welcome to this panel discussion.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Byron. Thank you very much, Riyadh and Eddie, for your introductory remarks. I am supposed to be chairing the panel discussion. I am Professor Emerita at the University of the West Indies, former director of the Institute of International Relations, and a member of the CPC, co-sponsoring this panel discussion with Diplomats Without Borders. I'd like to not only welcome our wonderful audience, but our distinguished panel and all the colleagues above. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the people who will be speaking to you in the next few minutes. Now, I'm going to introduce them in the order in which you will hear the presentations. Our first presenter, Roberta Clark, unfortunately is not speaking directly to you today. She has recorded her presentation, and we are very hopeful that she may be able to join us for the question and answer session. Roberta Clark is a commissioner on the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. She is their rapporteur for the rights of women and also rapporteur for human rights defenders and justice operators. Previously, she was the rapporteur for the LGBTI persons. Roberta has led UN Women's regional offices in Eastern and Southern Africa, in the Asia-Pacific region, and in the Caribbean, and in Libya. And prior to her UN career, she was a lawyer in Trinidad and Tobago. She continues her involvement in civil society at national and international levels, including past roles as chair of the executive committee of the International Commission of Jurists, president of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence in Trinidad and Tobago, and currently she is the chair of the board of Nobel Women's Initiative and of the harassment committee of the Caribbean Court of Justice. Roberta is and has always been an activist for social justice and for gender equality. So that is our first speaker. She will be followed by Dr. Natalie Dietrich Jones, a senior research fellow at Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. Natalie's interests include geographies of the border and the governance of migration, particularly intra-regional migration in the Caribbean. Natalie chairs a migration and development cluster, which is exploring contemporary issues on migration which affect the Caribbean and its diaspora. She holds an MPhil in Development Studies from Cambridge and a PhD in Development Policy from the University of Manchester. And she's also currently undertaking a multi-island project on the response to Venezuelan migration in the Southern Caribbean territories. She's also principal investigator for the Jamaican component of a South-South migration and food insecurity project, a project that is led by Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. Welcome, Natalie. We look forward to listening to you. And our final presenter is none other than Professor Ivor Lloyd Griffith. Professor Griffith is a founding fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and also a senior associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And he is a fellow with Global Americans. Professor Griffith he has served as Vice Chancellor of the University of Guyana, President of Fort Valley State University in Georgia, Provost of universities in Virginia and New York, and as dean at Florida International University in Miami. He has published widely on Caribbean affairs, including several scholarly books, and the latest is Challenged Sovereignty. He has also published, I think it is his first novel, Sylvie's Love and Loss. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the 2015 Dr. William J. Perry Award for Excellence in Security and Defense Education. He has received the 2017 Pacique Crown of Honor, Guyana's third highest national award. And his next book, Oil and Climate Change in Guyana's Wet Neighborhood, is forthcoming later this year. Welcome, Ivlo. We look forward to listening to you. So without any further ado, we are going to begin the presentations with the recording of Roberta Clark. Thank you very much.
I am here, so I can be in the panel as it was originally intended at the end.
Wonderful.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome, Roberta. This is great.
Yeah. So do I begin?
Please do. Over to you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Let me just start off by sort of saying thank you and hello to all of the co-panelists, but also to Diplomats Without Borders, and especially if I can say hello to Eddie and Riyadh, who have been doing all this work behind the scenes to get us here, and of course, you, Jessica, so glad to be here with you. I have been sort of asked to look at the human rights implications of the US deportations and the impact on the Caribbean. So I just want to thank you for this invitation. In this sense, whilst I'm a member of Diplomats Without Borders, I'm also here representing the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, of which I'm a commissioner. So the phenomenon of human mobility is complex, and that's quite a trite thing to say because we all know that, and is influenced by the political, economic, social, and environmental context of states. We know that the mobility occurs as a result of a combination of push and pull factors, and these push factors, perhaps even now quite exacerbated in our region, include political violence and instability, in some countries about persecution, armed conflict, generalized violence. Let's think about the context of Haiti right now, the impact of organized crime on security, continued persistent high levels of poverty, and lack of development opportunities, amongst others. And more recently, the Inter-American Commission has noted that climate change-related emergencies, food insecurities, and the lack of care and assistance measures are also pushing people to move and to seek development opportunities or just seek protection in other countries in the region. So we are in an era where, perhaps not unexpectedly, there is much voluntary, I say voluntary because what really is voluntary in the context where you feel you have no choice, but there's voluntary movement of peoples. The world has been made small, it has been made noble, and people appreciate that there are options beyond their origin boundaries. And so it is also a moment where the populations in transit and destination countries question the sustainability of what seems like a never-ending flow. Sometimes a trickle, sometimes a stream, sometimes a deluge of people looking for new hope and prospects. This is a legitimate concern that states and populations have for regulated and managed migration. And certainly we are experiencing these anxieties here in the Caribbean as well. States are concerned to plan resource allocations for their current and for their projected populations. And these anxieties can be expressed in xenophobia and can trigger politics that seeks to shut down borders, turn away asylum seekers and refugees, and without full consideration of individual circumstances, and may even do so in discriminatory manner, targeting some nationalities or ethnicities. While the Commission recognizes that states have the authority, of course, to set their migration policies and determine who may enter, exit, and remain in their territory according to international principles, it's not a free sheet. All policies, laws, and practices implemented on migration must respect and ensure the human rights of persons in mobility, which are just rights and liberties that derive from human dignity. States must implement measures that guarantee the right to seek asylum and to receive international protection, access to immigration procedures that respect due process and judicial protection. Also, these measures must recognize the right to a nationality and also the prohibition of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, as well as the principle of non-refoulement where that is applicable, and non-discrimination based on, for example, nationality, ethnicity, color, gender expression, gender identity, language, religion, social origin, sexual orientation, political opinion, and the like. So the Commission has been commenting on mass deportations for a while now, and we see that mass deportations can severely impact the human rights of persons deported or returnees and the development processes of their receiving countries. And let us also reflect on the fact that sometimes people are deported not even to their own origin country, but to third countries. And that's a very complex scenario. Where the protections lie, that may be something we want to discuss. Origin countries receiving returnees may lack the infrastructure and the resources to support their reintegration, particularly if they're coming in large numbers. And as such, the sudden return of these large numbers of persons can overwhelm social services, of course, contribute to unemployment and increase social tensions. Depending on the numbers to be deported, this may impact Caribbean economies by reducing remittances, which is a vital source of income for many countries. And I think we know some of the data on that. Families reliant upon remittances may struggle to afford basic necessities, including, the necessities you need to send children to school and to ensure their health and their social security. And I suppose in the longer term, this may or may not even be in the longer term, because now this is coming with a range of policies around it, mass deportations and other policies. This may have the potential to push economies into recession, which undoubtedly will trigger further secondary movements, though destination countries may change. So the recent escalation of US deportation policies raises several human rights and developmental concerns. In its concluding observations to the visit to the US border back in 2019, the Commission highlighted that the implementation of fast-track deportation policies observed back then had seriously impacted the effective enjoyment of human rights by migrants, asylum seekers, and other people seeking international protection in the United States. The Commission recommended the United States to end fast-track deportations and automatic returns, since they're not based on individual decisions, and that's really important. You have mass deportations, you deny the due process rights that individuals have to have their particular circumstances considered and taken into account. So the due process guarantees were not complied with. And also, the Commission really spoke to the need to prioritize the consideration of the principle of non-refoulement, particularly if you're being returned to a country which is in big crisis. For example, Haiti, as we see now. In its most recent press release on the subject of deportations and migration policy, which we issued in February last month, the Commission highlighted the potential restriction on access to fair procedures for refugee status determination in light of the suspension of the U.S. refugee admissions program, and also the disabling of the app, which previously facilitated the scheduling of appointments to seek entry into the U.S. In addition, the Commission also expressed concern about the conditions under which mass detentions and then deportations from the U.S. were occurring, such as the use of restraints, undue restraints, use of handcuffs, and the degrading treatment in the transportation methods. In this regard, I just want to recall for all of us that the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has stated that criminalizing irregular migration, so someone who goes and overstays their visa, that's irregular migration, is not a legitimate state aim justifying the use of detention. States should therefore end the criminalization of irregular migration and work to end all immigration detention by implementing non-custodial, community-based alternatives to detention that fully protect and respect human rights of irregular migrants. And it is noteworthy that some Caribbean states have already started to voice the need for their citizens to be treated with dignity in the return process and have established mechanisms to handle the situation domestically upon the return of those citizens. Prior to this scenario of US mass deportations, the Commission had already noted in its report on human rights situation in Haiti the significant challenges that the state would face in adequately receiving returnees, and that was within the context of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, in February 2025, the February 2025 announcement by the US Department of Homeland Security to amend the period of extension and redesignation of Haiti for temporary protected status from 18 months to 12 months, now ending in August 2025, will have far-reaching challenges, not only for those Haitians directly affected, but for Haiti and other states in the Caribbean. What we know is that mass detention and deportation of Haitians, where they return to a country where internal displacement is already at an all-time high, and that's something we need to reflect on, will of course contribute to the severe political, economic, and social instability and expose those who are returned also to the prospects of violence. So before concluding, I just want to highlight that, the Inter-American human rights standards on the treatment of persons in mobility and migrants, and I do, recommend that you have a look at Article 12 of the American Convention on Human Rights, and which speaks to the right to seek and enjoy asylum, the principle of non-refoulement, the absolute prohibition of collective expulsion, among other articles. So I want to end by saying, for the most part, in relation to CARICOM states, migration, regular or irregular, has been motivated by economic considerations. Caribbean people have been leaving in constant streams looking for better quality of life, seeking to end the transmission of intergenerational poverty. Many take great risk, live under the radar in foreign, so that they can send back money, they can send back barrels of goods, and they can eventually find a pathway to permanent residence and eventually citizenship for themselves and for their families. And this no doubt has led to brain and energy drain, even whilst it has also brought remittances to our region. Perhaps, I don't mean to be provocative, but perhaps we should be focusing, in addition to, or focus on the deportation policy of another country, we should be focusing on how Caribbean states can better align our governance and our social and economic policies to increase the sense of security and opportunities for all in this region, so that so many feel that they have no choice but to take risks that come with irregular migration. After all, it is the case that migration for the most part is triggered by our inabilities or incapacities to progressively realize economic and social rights in the Caribbean. So I thank you for your attention and for the opportunity to participate.
Robert, thank you very much for those thought-provoking remarks. And without further ado, we will go to Dr. Natalie Dietrich-Jones. Natalie, over to you.
Thank you, Prof. Barron. I'm just checking that you can see the slides.
Yes,
All
we
right.
can.
Okay. So many thanks for the invitation. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel, examining this important topic, and to be preceded by Ms. Clark. I think she has picked up early on some things that I had wanted to explore in my own presentation. So I was asked to look at whether Caribbean states, and I focused on CARICOM states, Caribbean states are prepared to respond to an increase in arrivals arising from the deportation agenda. But I've taken a little bit of a broader look, and you will see why in a second, to examine the larger shift in policy, and we can put an asterisk or question mark after that. You'll see in a moment why I say that. So trying to move my slide. I just wanted to set the context in terms of what philosophical slash ethical slash moral and academic perspective informs this presentation. So Lloyd and Mons, who are feminist political geographers, argue that the crisis that we face today is part of a history of how cycles of crisis have led to the expansion of enforcement policies with the Caribbean as a staging ground. They were actually, interestingly, writing just at the cusp of Trump taking over in 2019. And essentially, their argument is that the deportation and deterrence mechanisms that the US utilizes are not new. They've been developed over years of practice, and that the Caribbean has been the site of this practice. Now, so the expansion of violence, because they use violence a lot in their work, is not a recent phenomenon. And one of the things to bear in mind is that while the Caribbean has been subject to that violence, we have also been participants in perpetuating that violence. For example, in the 1990s, by serving as offshore sites for the processing of Haitian migrants. So I just wanted to share that because it largely informs the way that I approach this presentation. And so the deportation agenda, is it really a new US policy? So elements of it are new: the challenge to birthright citizenship, the suspension of asylum processing, which was mentioned by Ms. Clark. And now this heightened challenge in terms of the visa restrictions that could be imposed against Caribbean states that receive medical missions from Cuba. But by and large, this deportation agenda has defined the US immigration policy. I've said in another forum that one of the things that actually unifies the Republican and Democratic approach is this anti-immigrant, anti-undocumented immigrant rhetoric and approach, which is managed through deportation. So the policy agenda is larger than this deportation agenda because it involves some key challenges to human rights and protection of the human rights of migrants, in particular things like the end of asylum processing, which I had mentioned earlier, but also the suspension eventually of TPS for some vulnerable categories of migrants, which for our context, the most pertinent are Haitian and Venezuelan migrants. So this new or evolving or shifting policy agenda raises some concerns for the region. Involuntary and voluntary returns will test the capacity of our states. Ms. Clark has already mentioned that, so I don't need to emphasize that. But there are some other concerns about sovereignty and our ability to autonomously negotiate with a powerful state, reception of involuntarily returned migrants in particular, and also how we might play a role, since some states have been asked to support the deportation agenda by acting as transit sites or third states that would receive where the home country will not receive the migrant. So how will CARICOM states negotiate this new playing field, this new deterrence mechanism? There's also the issue of sustainability and whether there might be changes to formal migration programs such as seasonal farm work or temporary programs that allow for movement of hospitality workers, other types of domestic care workers, and so on. Will these opportunities now be curtailed as part of this larger response to manage migration. And then this issue, which kind of has been in the background, not a lot of attention is being, enough attention, I think, is being paid to this, is the heightened precarity of migrants who are desperate to reach to the US for whatever reason, but engage in even more dangerous journeys to arrive. That's both by air and by land. And we've seen an increase in missing and dead migrants over the last 5 years. In the Eastern Caribbean in particular, there have been some incidents related to travel of West African migrants. So we need to be very conscious of the potential fallout of this new policy regime. And these concerns are valid because it's been highlighted in research that Caribbean states lack comprehensive mechanisms to protect migrant rights. But one of the things I have argued is that notwithstanding the deficits, which I'll show you in a second, in the protection space, so notwithstanding these deficits, there is scope for CARICOM member states to protect the rights of migrants by being compliant with core international human rights instruments to which they are party. So let's look at the state of international commitments in the Caribbean. Okay, so my slides are acting up, but right. So the principal human rights instruments in terms of protection of vulnerable migrants in particular, those who want to seek asylum, is the convention the convention related to the status of refugees, 1951, and then the associated protocol, which came into being in 1967. So 10 CARICOM member states are signatory to the Refugee Convention and 9 are signatory to the protocol. Now, there are varying degrees of, let's say, ratification, because some have only signed, while some have signed and ratified. And this is important to point out, for example, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, which is currently experiencing the impact of the Venezuelan migration crisis. So that government has argued, yes, we've signed the agreement, but we haven't ratified, so we're not bound to respect the principle of refoulement, for example, and we don't have to receive migrants and process them and give them the protections that they are entitled to, because we haven't really signed on to this agreement. So those are the CRS 51, I'm using the short form, and the PSR 61 are binding international commitments. That's different from the Brazil Declaration and the GCM and GCR. So the Brazil Declaration is an offshoot of the Cartagena Declaration, which emerged in the 80s with the crisis in Central America. Persons were fleeing Guatemala and other countries, and they were heading to the US. And Latin American governments developed this agreement, which has this expanded definition of the refugee. And the Brazil Declaration commemorated the Cartagena Declaration 30 years later. And 13 CARICOM member states and associate member states have endorsed this declaration, which essentially means that they support this expanded definition of the refugee and could, if they desire to, enshrine the expanded definition and the protections that it would afford migrants in domestic legislation, which is what Belize has done. So within this context, Belize stands out as a best case scenario, but I'm going to point out something later about Belize. Right, and then the GCM and the GCR, which are the most recent international mechanisms, they're non-binding, but essentially states which have endorsed the agreements agree to protect migrants' rights in different ways. and all CARICOM member states have endorsed these two non-binding agreements. So this diversity, because on average, it's about 71% of the CARICOM member states that have agreed to the CSR 51 and the protocol. This means that at the domestic level, so while it appears at the international level that things are okay because we've signed on to and or ratified this agreement, at the domestic level, it's another picture entirely. So there is very limited legislation on refugees. Belize has a Refugee Act. TCI, Cayman, and Montserrat incorporate provisions related to refugee protection and rights within their immigration legislation. Only two countries, one has a draft and one an operational refugee policy. And this is problematic because it means that where refugee status determination is to occur, there are not clear standard operating procedures. There may not be an eligibility committee. One exists in St. Vincent, but I don't believe it has either a policy or legislation. And in terms of right to work for asylum seekers, this is not broadly enjoyed. So while countries like Guyana, for example, have given right to stay for Venezuelans, these Venezuelans don't have the right to work. And only Suriname, from what I've gleaned from my desk research, has this right to work for asylum seekers. So a very dismal picture if we were suddenly to have what people say is an influx, but an influx of or an increase in vulnerable migrants, either those seeking protection or those that may be claiming asylum. So there are some additional considerations, right? Is this all a bad thing to get this many migrants? One of the things that we need to think through is the contribution that migrants can make to our societies, right? So socioeconomic integration is very important. It's even more pressing for our societies, which are currently experiencing aging population and high rates of emigration. So we have declining birth rates, aging populations, emigration of highly skilled nationals could, for example, these returnees, voluntary and involuntary, address this socio-demographic deficit. But there are also some other considerations, and these are the considerations that I think are typically highlighted in terms of security. So there is very extensive movement of illicit goods and, let's say, services, but goods, so guns, drugs, and also people, right? We are known as a mixed migration space. And so in addition to what people would tend to refer to as formal or documented flows, we have human trafficking, we have human smuggling, and this can be an additional complexity within the context of these increasing returns. There's also the issue of how we have traditionally responded in the past to vulnerable migrants. So we're not very different from the US, although we criticize the US because we have adopted in some instances a very securitized approach to migration by introducing, for example, new visa regimes to manage migration. And that is why I had highlighted Belize, because even though Belize is seen as a best case country, because of this adoption of the Cartagena Declaration and domestication of refugee provisions through a separate law, it recently introduced some visa requirements for Haitian nationals. Now, Belize is not distinct in that regard. CARICOM countries which waived the visa requirement for Haitians reintroduced those visa requirements shortly after, because they could not manage, they said, the increase in arrivals of Haitians who were in large part using their states as transit countries to travel onwards to the US. So anyways, I'm wrapping up. What does this all mean, right? It means we have limited capacity for reception of asylum seekers and migrants in need of protection. And as I mentioned, this securitized approach, I can speak about Jamaica, which is where I'm from. We have been fining persons who arrive in Jamaica from Haiti. There's a lot of debate in social media and elsewhere about whether they should be given the right to claim asylum if that's what they wish. But by and large, fining and summarily returning to Haiti. So there are no access to humanitarian visas, although we do have a record of having granted extended stay in the past to Montserratians, for example, following the volcanic eruption, but also Haiti following the 2010 earthquake. And then we have overburdened social systems which are ill-equipped to respond to, and I want to emphasize the psychosocial needs of persons who are displaced. And then finally, limited scope for migrant integration. So if you are from CARICOM, it's possible that you could get some economic and social rights through issuance of a work permit or CSME certification. But if you are from a third country, it becomes very problematic. And without any formal framework to provide those rights, then migrants will kind of either end up in limbo or have to move on elsewhere. So what is the conclusion from all of this? CARICOM member states are to concertedly, and I must emphasize concertedly, respond to the changes in US policy given the potential social, economic, and potential impacts on their countries. There has been differing approaches, for example, to this Cuban medical mission issue. Some countries have responded very vociferously and asserted their sovereignty and rejected the US approach. But others are now looking inward and saying, okay, if we can't accept Cuban medical missions, do we need to look elsewhere, right? Because we cannot bear the brunt of US pressure on us. So as SIDS, CARICOM member states face challenges with migration management. However, the current environment could or should serve as an impetus to transform migration governance structures. And I've argued this elsewhere using the term tipping point, where I've argued that these crises can actually be positively transformatory for our societies. And finally, ending where Ms. Clark started, this importance of a human rights-based approach being at the center of any evolved policy response that we develop. But the question, of course, is how much sovereignty are we willing to exert or cede? So I'll end there and thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Very thought-provoking. And I now invite our final panelist to present, Professor Ivor Griffith. And after that, we will open up the floor for discussion. So I'm encouraging the audience to upload your questions as we go along. Please do, as we are now going into the presentation of our final panelist. Ivor, over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, everyone. See if I can get my slideshow. I want to begin by applauding the Diplomats Without Borders and the Caribbean Policy Consortium for this initiative, and to thank Eddie and Riyad and David for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. You know, this is both timely and critical. The subject of the conversation is a timely one. We're having this conversation here largely because of the initiatives and policies of a gentleman whose name begins with Donald, whose first name is Donald. And we're having this conversation on the 12th of the month. But I want to use as an epigraph for my part of the conversation something said by another gentleman whose first name was Donald. And he said this something to which I will refer in a minute on the 12th of the month, not the month of March, but the month of February. The year was 2002. And this gentleman is Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld was at the time Defense Secretary of the United States, and he was at the press briefing talking about the war in Iraq. And in response to a question, he made a proposition which had an element of both humor and seriousness. And this is what the proposition was, a proposition I want to use as a kind of epigraph for my part of the conversation. He talked about things that are known knowns and things that are known unknowns. Actually said, reports that say that something hasn't happened are always interesting to me because, as we know, there are known knowns. These are things that we know, but they're also known unknowns, things that we know we don't know. And so I want to use Donald Rumsfeld's formulation of known knowns and known unknowns in the context of something that one of my favorite philosophers, Bertrand Russell, said way back in the 1950s, advising that we hang question marks on things we take for granted. And so in the context of what Donald Rumsfeld said, in the context of what Bertrand Russell proposes, I want to focus my presentation on one question. What are some of the known knowns and what are some of the known unknowns in relation to this United States deportation to the Caribbean? So we'll start with some of the known knowns. Some of these known knowns may be known unknowns to some folks. But if you think of the known knowns and coming back to the S word used by Natalie and Roberta to some extent, Caribbean states like under this deportation regime are caught between a rock and a hard place in regard to their sovereignty. And that is partly because under customary international law, a country is generally considered obligated to take back its citizens who are ejected from other countries. That is a known. But if you take a little further, something to which in the context of this hemisphere, the countries of this region have signed on to, although the Caribbean countries themselves, most Caribbean countries have not signed on to it, but in the context of customary international law, they're caught in this sovereignty vice. If you go back to, as I've had a chance to do in the last couple of weeks, the Convention on the Status of Aliens signed in Havana, Cuba in 1928, to which the Dominican Republic, to which Cuba, to which Haiti, the only independent countries at the time, signed on. And if you read Article 6 of that convention, it says, states are required to receive their nationals expelled sovereign from foreign soil who seek to re-enter their territory. So there is a vice, a sovereignty vice, caught between a hard and a rock and a hard place, where this known has an international customary legal element to it that Caribbean countries are caught in. That's one, I think, useful known. But reminiscent of something that Natalie Dietrich Jones mentioned, if you invoke this guy, Yogi Berra, this baseball icon. He talked at one point about deja vu all over again. And as I was reflecting on this deportation phenomenon in the contemporary context, I was taken back to the 1990s and to the 2000s when we had a deportation reality many Caribbean countries were dealing with related to the issue of drugs and crime. I've written a lot about this deportation in the 20s, in the 1990s and 20s in the context of the drugs phenomenon. And interestingly, if you were to pick one country alone in the Caribbean, Jamaica, between 1993 and 1997, over 6,000 Jamaicans were deported from North America and Europe. If you fast forward to the years 2000 to 2014, over 45,000 Jamaicans deported from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Canada. But it was not only Jamaica that suffered the deportation phenomenon. There was one infamous case where the Canadian government took a number of Guyanese, dumped them at the airport in Guyana, and took off. They apologized, but guess what? They did not take them back. So this phenomenon of deportation is not new. The current incarnation has an element of novelty, but if you reflect on what happened decades ago and what continues to happen in some respects, that's a known we need to keep in mind. But focus for a minute on the current regime of United States deportation. The entire Caribbean is impacted. This is a chart that captures the portrait of deportations going back to 2024 November. Biden was still in power at the time. And if you were to take a look at this chart, you'll see that even the very small jurisdictions like Montserrat and Bermuda and the Turks and Caicos are impacted. We hear dramatically about Jamaica, over 5,000. We hear about Guyana and Trinidad, but almost every country in the Caribbean is impacted by this contemporary regime of deportations. And if you were to do a summary of what this portrait reflects, you'll see that Haiti is at the top of the list. About 76% of all the Caribbean deportations are intended to come from Haiti, to be of Haitians. Next would be Jamaica, followed by Guyana, followed by Trinidad and Tobago. But as I said a minute ago, even the small jurisdictions, Turks and Caicos, and Kitts and Nevis, Antigua Barbuda, it's a region-wide impact insofar as a known is concerned. But remember, two colleagues, and I think Natalie mentioned an element of this, we have had our own intra-regional deportations for a while. Cayman Islands sending back Jamaicans, Bahamas sending back Haitians, Jamaica sending back Haitians, Trinidadians sending back Guyanese, Suriname sending back Guyanese, Barbados sending back Guyanese. At one point, it was like almost everybody sending back Guyanese. That is not happening anymore since the advent of the oil. Trinidad sending back people to Venezuela, Dominican Republic sending back to Haiti. And in regard to the DR sending back to Haiti, there has been ever since the last 2 years, significantly from last year, massive deportations from the Dominican Republic to Haiti. More than 206,000 Haitians sent back from the Dominican Republic to Haiti just in 2024. Part of the known reality is that within the Caribbean itself, countries have been sending back nationals of other Caribbean countries to them. But before I go on to some of the known unknowns that are recommended for consideration, it's important to remind ourselves that in the context of the elections and the impact of the outcome of the elections on this deportation proposition, we already begun to see some of the buyer's remorse. People who are of Cuban descent or Cubans based in parts of the United States who were big supporters of Trump are now saying, oh my gosh, what did I do? But it's not only Cuban Americans or Cubans who supported Trump who are now having some buyer's remorse. Right here in New York 2 months ago, a massive rally in a part of people of Caribbean and Caribbean descent, along with people from other parts of the world, were having a big rally saying, please, Mr. Trump, help me, show compassion. I supported you. Element of the known is the buyer's remorse, which we are seeing Caribbean people within the United States who themselves, even though they knew that Trump made no apologies about intending to send back, still were hoping that he would save them, send back others, not my people. No, buyer's remorse. Let's move quickly since time is passing and we want to have a conversation. What are some of the known unknowns that have elements of known knowns? Well, we're not sure what's going to be the impact on the crime situation in many jurisdictions that already have significant challenges with criminality. Think of what the people in Haiti are pondering. Think of what the people in Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica and in parts of Guyana already have significant challenges with criminality. What the impact of people being sent back, not all of whom have violent criminal records, but in the context of societies that already have clear and present dangers related to criminality, the impact of the deportation on the criminal enterprise is a known unknown. What about employment? It happens that I suspect most of the people who are being sent back would be intending to be gainfully employed, but what is the reality of the economic and social landscape of the societies that allow for a goodness of fit between the intent and the capabilities and the expectations to find gainful employment? What about the social integration, the human integration? Many people who are going to be sent back perhaps had not gone to their countries to which they're being sent for years. Many of them left Caribbean jurisdictions when they were quite young. Many of them may not have families closely associated. That's a known unknown. What will be the reintegration reality when you come to the countries which people are being sent, especially when they themselves may not have any close familial links with the countries involved? When I was doing the study back in the 90s on the deportation reality, one of the interesting phenomena that I think I came upon is the fact that most Caribbean jurisdictions have no legislative mechanism to deal with deportations. Some of them have, as you heard from previous speakers, have elements of refugee legislation. Jamaica was the only country in the 1990s that passed a law, given the number of people who were coming back. We got to do something. So in 1994, they passed something called the Criminal Justice Administration Amendment Act, trying to get a handle around. But guess what? A good friend of mine at the time, who was Director of Public Prosecutions, Glenn Andrade, said to me, Ivlo, the first time we arrest anybody under this law, the law is going to be struck out because it's unconstitutional. It had so many elements that violated the Jamaican Constitution. It was a desperate search for a way to cope. And if you ask the question, fast forward to the 2024, 2025, are there any Caribbean countries that have a legislative mechanism to deal with deportation? The answer is no. That is a known unknown that will complicate the lives of the rulers and the leaders in the Caribbean, because there's no legislative mechanism to deal with people who are of their own nationality or citizenship coming back, not of their own volition, even though some are doing self-deportation, so to speak. That is a known unknown. But then you ask the question, why don't we make life a little more complicated? When you take away the social services, some of which are underwritten by US aid programs in the Caribbean, life becomes even more interesting and complex, both for the people being returned and for the leaders and managers of the states to which the citizens are being returned. But here's another element of the known unknown. There was outrage expressed last November, December by Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos and Grenada when it was made public that the United States intended to have those countries be third-party hosts. Bahamas and TCI and Grenada said absolutely not. You haven't discussed this matter with us. How can you make a public statement saying that you're going to be sending people from other countries to our countries? But it was less than a month ago, it became public in Guyana that there had been conversations started in Guyana and in the United States for Guyana being one of the hosts of third-party nationals. That is a known unknown. My own suspicion is that given the complexity of what Guyana is experiencing on the Venezuela front, the importance of United States being an ally in that regard, it is quite likely that in the next few months, you'll see the announcement that Guyana will be hosting third-party nationals. That is a known unknown that we need to worry about and watch, because Caribbean countries are being asked, as Panama has accepted to do, as El Salvador has accepted to do, take nationals from other jurisdictions and host them, even if only temporarily. But before I end, I want to make mention of another element that is a known unknown. I was recommended to a Jamaican friend of mine, Earl Muxham, whose radio program I was on a couple of weeks ago, that I would bet $100 of your money, I said, Earl, you're likely to see restrictions in American legal migration to the US. The visas are going to be restricted. The efforts to administrative procedures to enable visas to be processed in a timely manner is going to be more complicated. And as a matter of fact, if you take the announcement only within the last few weeks that the United States will be cutting back by 10% the staffs, both US staffs and domestic local staff in a number of embassies and consulates across the world. And the State Department announced and made it quite clear. What this will do, it will create greater backlogs. It will create delays in processing. I think you're likely to see, by direct and indirect measures, a stricture on the legal migration from the Caribbean to the United States. The cuts at the embassies, the cuts at the consulates will allow that to happen. So let me end my part of this conversation by invoking the name of a guy called Martin Niemöller, a religious leader from Germany in the 1940s, 1930s, and 1940s, who struggled against things that we're seeing elements of in these United States. And I decided to modify some of what the Reverend Martin said, to say this. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. And then they came for the immigrants. This is my modification of Niemöller's phraseology. Then they came for the immigrants, and I did not speak out because I was not an immigrant. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak out for me. We are caught in the region between a rock and a hard place, a rock and a hard place that has a number of implications, both international legal, domestic circumstances. And with that, I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ivlo. A lot of information and very thought-provoking. Now, we have overrun our time, but I am reliably told that we will have about 30 minutes for questions. So far, I have one question from the wider audience, and I'm going to add a question of my own to it to get us started. I had two questions of my own, but Ivlo has already answered one of them. So Mr. Michael Sharp notes that the United States seems to be leaving the role of asylum, of refugee and protection, migrant protection, that it espoused and at a much earlier time, followed by other countries from the North. And he asks, from a North American Caribbean diaspora perspective, what can Caribbean diaspora communities in the North do to try to impact positive change? Can Caribbean second and third generation folks in North America really have some meaningful impact on the policies of the countries where they live, North American and European, I suppose he means. So that is one question for the panel to address. And then I have a simpler one, which is, which Caribbean countries, if any, have made preparations for the mass returns of their undocumented migrant citizens? I've partly answered this, but it would be interesting to hear a bit more on it. For example, we know, that Mexico in the Greater Caribbean did quite a lot, but have there been, to your knowledge, any discernible preparations in our own Caribbean countries, our part of the Caribbean? So over to the panel to answer those questions. Who would like to make a first comment?
Yes, okay. If I can offer a comment on the first question. And my comment has to do with two elements of the question. Caribbean nationals who are citizens in these United States with a full panoply of rights and obligations can make an impact. The impact is not likely to be immediate or near term, it can be long term. But the long term has to do with activism and engagement in the process, national political arena in which there are people called mayors and governors and legislators at the state and at the federal, at the Congress and the Senate level. Vote, become engaged, help to make the difference in who gets elected, help to make a difference in who gets elected and the policies that they make. And in the context of making a difference, keep in mind that the 2024 elections are not the end of all, not the end all. They're going to be congressional, senatorial, gubernatorial elections in 2026. Go out and vote, organize now, register, get involved. Identify the policies that are in your national self-interest, your regional self-interest, your personal interests. Don't sit back and then make a reaction of, oh, see what they're doing to us. Be engaged, be active, make a difference. It's going to be impactful in the long term.
Thank you very much.
Let me offer an additional comment. It may be a cynical comment. Can I make one additional comment in that respect?
Yes.
If we from the Caribbean have family who are intending to come and do illegal stuff, dissuade them. Don't let your folk come and get involved in illegal stuff and be caught in the vice. Don't facilitate illegality by turning a blind eye. Is my cousin from here? Is my family from there, and then you're caught 4 or 5 times and enabling a reduction of illegality, and then be engaged in the political process to make a difference in who gets elected and the policies they will be advocating and adumbrating and implementing once they get elected.
Thank you very much, Ivlo. Yes, I can see both Roberta's and Natalie's hands are up. So, Roberta, I'll let you go first, and then
Natalie's hand was up well before mine.
Oh, sorry. Okay, Natalie, you lead.
Sure. Thank you. So I wanted to respond to the first question about the diaspora by expanding the categories of persons who could potentially challenge the current proposals that have been implemented by the Trump administration. So just using the example of TPS, there are some migrant organizations that have, through the court system, sought to challenge the end to TPS. And so there are options, I believe, through outside of lobbying, so through using the court system, for example, that could potentially work to if not reverse, at least slow the transition in these different policies that have been introduced. So that's my response to the first question. The second one, in terms of preparation, because thanks for flagging that. So I very quickly looked to see what Mexico was doing. We are nowhere near that level in terms of preparation. Setting up reception centers, tents and stadiums and warehouses to accommodate people, according to this New York Times article. So one of the deficits that arises from the environment that I described earlier is that we don't really have reception centers in the region. A lot of them emerge, again, through activities related to NGOs who might operate. They may have an office, or there's a church or a school that might serve as that reception center. So there are no dedicated reception centers, and the machinery that responds is usually triggered for an event. So it's not like there's this pre-prepared, this is what happens when people land and so on. And I don't even think the governments know how many people to expect. That's based on what I've seen in media reported after the 48th heads of government meeting. So comments, I think, from PM Motley and PM Wholeness, where they were saying that we need to get the numbers so that we can be prepared. So that suggests, I think, what the level of preparation is, unfortunately. But we would need some massive resources, both cash resources, but also human resources, I think, to respond to the different needs that people might have. So again, the psychosocial, but also the health, and the other things, like if the children might stay for long and they need education and they're speaking in a foreign language, do we have persons who can interpret and provide services in different languages, for example? So those are some of the things that I would highlight.
Thank you, Natalie. Just in passing, I do recall that in the earlier Trump administration period, when people were being picked up from all over, and there was a tremendous disruptive effect of separation of children from parents. And I know that the Caribbean consular staff in embassies in the United States, embassies and consulates, were stretched to the maximum, trying to ensure the protection of children of Caribbean migrants at that time. So there are a lot of implications also for our diplomatic staff in North America. Roberta, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I really enjoyed the presentations of everyone. The question you asked there, are Caribbean countries prepared? Well, I guess the first thing, which is what Natalie said, the preparation requires information. What are the numbers that we're talking about, and how do we disaggregate who we know will be sent back? Disaggregate them by the length of time being away, because if they just went last year or 2 years ago, the reintegration process is not going to be difficult. If they left as children and come back as adults, as was happening, threatening, remember the Windrush moment a few years ago, that's a different kind of reintegration that's required. So I think we need to first of all have an understanding of the numbers and the disaggregation on a number of bases. One, how long have they been out of the region? What are their ages? Because what you're going to prepare differently for children than you're going to prepare for the elderly or for people of working age. If they have working age, maybe it's easier to prepare for them because they come with their whole body and they go into the labor market. So I think we need to know that as well. But also, of course, which is the concern of, I see Foreign Minister Johnson Smith from Jamaica, as well as Prime Minister Gonzalez from St. Vincent. They want to know, are these people coming back? How many of them have a background of serious criminal offenses? So you also want to know, are these just people who are being returned for overstaying their visas, or these are people who have also been involved in criminal activity and they're coming back home, as I think somebody mentioned earlier, the earlier deported in the early 2000s. So I think that's the first thing. But when I look at the data that was provided by Mr. Lloyd Griffith, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your very interesting first name. Is it Ivelaw?
Ivelaw.
Ivelaw, very nice. It's small countries, we can manage some things. And for the majority of the countries outside of course, Haiti is a big outlier, given the size of its population and the complexity of the issues there. But thinking of outside Jamaica, Guyana, and Trinidad, the numbers are coming back to the rest of the Caribbean are really quite small. So I mean, I want to think that this is something that we can manage because, we have the competencies to manage it, but it does require planning, knowing who is being returned and how we're going to reintegrate them. For those who are coming back with some sort of criminal background, what might be the process of reintegration, but also rehabilitation, skills building. It's a social policy challenge, but I don't think it's outside of the existing social policy challenges that we have in this region already. And so maybe we have to think of this as an opportunity for us to go back into our toolbox to see how we're going to address that. And thinking about people who are coming back, particularly if they're in the working age span, as people who are going to contribute to our economies. We have to think of it in that way. It's a blessing. Every one of these countries in the Caribbean have declining birth rates. And so what we know is that, we have an aging and declining population. All right. So I think it's manageable. I want to say in relation to whether countries are prepared, I saw on a news report that St. Lucia, I believe it is, has set up a task force to prepare for those who are being returned. And I think that's a proactive approach. And Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines has been asking for information about those who are to be deported. I think that's going to be really important in us figuring out what we do next.
Thank you very much. Now there are two more questions that I'd like to put to you. One is coming from Garfield Manuel, and he mentions the frequency of natural disasters and the fact that natural disasters have an impact on Caribbean migration. Now, what are the provisions? He'd like the panel to comment on the provisions CARICOM states should make to address this challenge in light of the new US administration. That is one question. I would think that on the small scale, we actually have a good record in terms of hosting that kind of migrant, and there are two other questions. One is short and one is longer. Kathleen LaGuardia appreciates the presentations delivered by all the panelists. Given the current trajectory of US policy towards the region and recognizing the asymmetries and dependencies of all the Caribbean countries on the US, what alternatives should Caribbean countries explore to substitute the development cooperation provided by Cuba? Should they succumb to external pressures and sever cooperative ties with Cuba? And then I noticed Edmund Dillon, who has a short question are Caribbean leaders waiting too long to respond to this situation, individually and collectively? So let me just throw in the last one that I see here from Ria Carrera. Hi, Ria. She says she's glad that the issue of children's rights came up. There are entire protocols to treat with them, and I do not think we are even close to being prepared. So those are the four comments and questions that I'm throwing out to the panel now. I think you should choose, each of you has the right to make an input, and we will be having one final round of questions and comments after this. So over to you now. Who is going to start?
I can go. I'll take the one on climate change because I'm working in that area at this very, very moment.
Right,
so
fire ahead.
Doing assessments of countries' migration policy regime and then their human security regimes to see in what ways they've accounted for human mobility within the context of climate change. So there are, I would say, ad hoc mechanisms in place, but these operate through the free movement regimes that we have. So for CARICOM nationals, the reception process is a little bit easier. And to date, we've most of the experiences we've had, so with the volcanic eruption in St. Vincent, for example, and then Barbuda's displacement, it's largely been nationals of the affected countries. But there also have been need to respond to non-nationals, so third-party countries, nationals who are present. So the free movement regime can, what we've tried to argue is that the free movement regime is flexible enough to accommodate these types of displacement. But what we want to see is greater mainstreaming of the recognition of human mobility within the context of climate change, environmental change, and disasters within the legislative framework. So if you examine the legislative frameworks in the region across the board, they don't really account for this type of displacement. And so there would need to be a change in the legislation, domestic legislation, to be able to recognize the rights of persons who are displaced through climate change, environmental change, or disasters. I hope that was clear. I can clarify if if not. But I'll hand over to the others to address the other questions that were posed.
Thank you, Natalie. Who wants to, Roberta, do you wish to comment on any of those issues?
Yeah. I mean, I think I said it before already about whether or not we're prepared. I think preparation will require information, but I think it starts there. But I think there are also things already that we can anticipate about who will be returned. I think there are those, well, I don't even know if we can anticipate it. Actually, let me roll that back. Because how you prepare for children and people in the working age is quite different from how you prepare for the elderly, or for how you prepare for people who have been in conflict with the law themselves, may not have had the benefit of an education where they can go into the productive labor force. So I think that these are things that we have to know, but certainly as they come in, I think we can start by, ourselves getting the information from those who are being returned. There has to be some sort of fact-finding, some provision of social assistance in the moment of the return, so that especially those who may not have a family. I think that's also especially complicated. If you don't have a family, it's going to be very hard. If you have a family, it'll still be difficult, but at least there's the sharing of the burden of the reintegration will be between the family, the community, and the state. So I would say I think we need to know more. And I don't know because if Laura, you've been following, maybe you have the statistics on who has been returned already. If what are the quantities of persons who have been returned in the last month. I'm not sure about that. Or Natalie, maybe but it might be useful to share that information.
I don't know, but what I wanted to say earlier is it kind of ties into the comment you made earlier about preparation and knowing the profile of the individuals who will come, is that the research suggests that most undocumented persons have been in the States for 10 years or longer. And
Okay.
that will pose, if that is the case for the Caribbean nationals who are returning, it will certainly pose some challenges for us in terms of socioeconomic integration. So I just wanted to flag that as a concern. The length of time will be one of the critical, length of time away, one of the critical issues that will need to be considered in drafting any appropriate response.
And of course, I'll interject. I'm going to ask Ivor to come in here. But we've been talking a lot about the role of the state. There's a tremendous role for civil society organizations. Our civil society, despite lack of resources, is a key component in bolstering the state's ability to respond to social challenges. Ivor, invite you to weigh in on these questions.
Absolutely, absolutely, just civil society. Before I make a comment on the civil society element, I want to pose, and that is a question of alternatives, especially if the threat regarding Cuba is actualized.
Yeah.
You know, when you think of the threat in regard to the Cuba-Caribbean connection, the health front, you begin to see how Caribbean sovereignty is challenged. Because here it is, an area of engagement with another Caribbean state going back decades is now used as a threat to get sovereign states to act differently of others. And when you think of possible alternatives to any withdrawal by Caribbean countries of the health support provided by Cuba, you come to the unfortunate conclusion that some of the possible alternatives themselves are under threat. Canada, a long-standing supporter of Commonwealth Caribbean and other Caribbean countries, is itself under threat. I was having a conversation with a significant Canadian colleague, friend of mine, about, and this is before the threat of the Cuba health workers thing came up. How can Canada, he said, boy, we are under the gun ourselves. Our foreign ministry, the global Canada, is already rethinking of withdrawing. And if you think of the European Union as an alternative, EU is also under threat. So being between a rock and a hard place in the sovereignty arena, critical situation for Caribbean. But you're quite right, Jessica. I think that it's incumbent upon not only civil society actors, but the business sectors in the Caribbean countries, which very often tend to pull themselves back and say, well, these are things for the government to take care of. They have got an obligation now to find out how can they help underwrite some of the social services needs. How can they help be part of the preparation rather than standing by and sitting back and waiting to criticize what the government is not doing? So I would say the civil society and the private sector. There are many businesses in the Caribbean that are multinational corporations coming out of Jamaica, coming out of Trinidad and Tobago. The onus is on them to see how they can help deal with the challenges presented to their societies, not only where they're headquartered, but elsewhere where they've got operations.
Thank you, Ivor. I must say I have been very pleased to see some, not all, but some robust responses on the question of Cuba and maintaining our relationship with Cuba that have been voiced by some of our governments. I was very, very happy to see that, to see those statements. Let's see how it goes. Now, I don't think I see new questions. Let me just check once more. I do see.
Jessica, I just want to answer about the civil society, when you get a chance.
Yeah.
I want to answer. I mean, I don't want to interrupt you. I just want to.
Okay. Well, let me ask one more. I see one last comment. According to a document released back in November 2024 by ICE, US ICE, 97,000 Caribbean nationals were identified as part of its enforcement and removal operations initiative. As of the date of the communique, there were 1.4 million non-citizens on its non-detained docket with final orders of removal. People from Caribbean countries accounted for about 6.7% of the list. And that individual is asking if there has been any change in those figures. This question is for Ivelaw. Andy Knight. Hi, Andy. So there's a question from Andy. Roberta would like to say something about civil society. And I would think maybe Natalie would like to also give a final word. And then, so one more intervention from each of our panelists. And then I will hand back to Eddie Green to give to round off things. Okay? So,
yeah.
Roberta?
Yeah, just on the civil society, you asked what's the role of civil society. There's always a role for civil society, right? Civil society monitors, they hold state accountable for meeting their obligations, but they also, very importantly, provide a lot of social assistance. But I would want us to be really very careful about the obligations that we put on civil society organizations, who in the main in the Caribbean don't receive state subventions. I mean, coming myself from the civil society world and organizations where you have to raise every penny to provide free services to the population, I think we have to be very careful about what we expect, unless we are saying alongside civil society, which may have the connection to communities, which may have the technical expertise to do the reorientation, the reintegration, the provision of housing and food, counseling services, because you'll need that. So they may have the expertise, but they need the resources to do that. So I guess my point is, yes, there is a role for civil society, but it's in partnership with the state, and with the state doing its part to resource civil society organizations as they do that work of reintegration and support, including therapeutic support to those who are, particularly if they've been returned after long periods away and they may not be coming back to family members.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Ivelaw, would you like to?
Well, I want to add Sure. Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah.
I want to add a footnote to Roberta's commentary on the civil society. Not only do I share your sentiment in its entirety, but I want to recommend that there's another element of civil society which need to be part of the conversation, and that is civil society in the diaspora.
Yeah.
Caribbean citizens in the diaspora who are organized as home associations, interest groups of one kind or another. Here is an opportunity to do the collective embrace of your peoples back home. How can you, whether you're organized in Brooklyn, Toronto, London, Montreal, how can you, not only with a view to sending back for one social occasion, how can you partner with civil society back in your home country? How can you enable the government to get some stress relief? So I want to recommend that part of the matrix of civil society conversation to be broadened to be civil society in the diaspora, which has a clear interest and an opportunity to contribute.
Very important point. And do you have anything else to add at this point, Ivelaw? Or should I invite Natalie?
My short answer to Andy is that I don't have the numbers. I've asked for them. But I want to flag something that I passed over quickly in one of the slides. You know how many, and this regards to TPS, you know how many people are on that list of temporary protected status for Haiti as of February 2025, more than 500,000. The actual number is 520,694. Think of more than 500,000 Haitians just in that temporary protected status category being sent back to contemporary Haiti. Clear and present danger on steroids.
Thank you, Ivlo. Natalie, would you like to make your final comments?
Yeah, also on civil society. So I've seen the value of their contribution to, as Ms. Clark said, holding states accountable, but more so providing services that the state does not provide because legislatively it says it cannot. So it doesn't have the protection in place for migrants through whatever appropriate visa or permit. And so in Curacao and Aruba, for example, it's the civil society organizations that are providing healthcare, prenatal care, and services to the LGBTI community, different services that are not necessarily readily available to migrants. And it is their advocacy that has led to changes in the policy landscape. So for example, I believe it is in Aruba, it's now possible for migrants to have private health insurance. In the past, they could not. So their activism is and advocacy is important. On the flip side, however, they're under-resourced, but they also rely on funding from states which are now retrenching their finances. So not just the US, right? So our main donor country is reducing official development assistance and other types of funding. So that undercuts the effectiveness of the civil society, which is already facing challenges due to lack of resources. So the state must play its part, not just through legislative action, but through providing appropriate financing to support the work of organizations that fill the gaps where they cannot or refuse to act.
Thank you very much. I would like to give my personal thanks to the members of the panel. We have had an extremely informative session. There's been a lot of expertise, a lot of information provided. Thank you all very much for your contributions to this morning. And also I'd like to thank the audience for your excellent questions and observations. And without any further ado, I hand over to Eddie, who will do the official vote of thanks and make his concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, moderator. I want to start by thanking you for the excellent work you did in navigating, helping to navigate this process over the last 1 hour, 57 minutes and 53 seconds, which means that I have less than 3 minutes to say what I have to say. And fortunately for me, I really want to endorse what you have said. This has been an extraordinary and a very important start to the connections that we want to make with the Caribbean and the international community on issues that are so relevant. And today, I join you in congratulating the panelists for setting out the issues so clearly and sometimes provocatively, and providing us an opportunity to deal with both the known knowns and the known unknowns. I think that we have an opportunity now to try to see how we can develop that dialogue based on the issues raised on the panel. First of all, with CARICOM, because they are our institutional coordinators for the regional response, as most of the panelists said. And therefore, I think that we have in our purview an opportunity to identify to the CARICOM community and our ministers of all stripes, including the foreign ministers in particular, the outcomes from this panel. But I want, just by way of thanks, to indicate that this particular event was coordinated by someone who said that he may be suffering from a split personality, and that is Ambassador Riyad Insanani. He, as a member of DBD, as well as the consortium, has done a fine job in establishing the basis for this particular dialogue and for interfacing and interacting with the panelists. And although we can't let him know, I want to say that we greatly appreciate his efforts. I also think that it's important for us to identify a young person, what we call at DBD, a young professional who has done human service in anchoring the technical aspects of this particular symposium. Her name is Jessica Yang, and I greatly appreciate her efforts, and I know that Riyad joins me in congratulating her for the impressive manner in which she went about her task. I think Diplomats Without Borders really is appreciative of the young professionals that we have that help to anchor things like these. And finally, I think that it's important for me to also indicate that behind the scenes also was one of our major coordinators of DVD, Leonie Rajmakers. And I think that without her guidance, we may not have had such a successful. So thank you very much. And now, in closing, let me just say to both the panelists and to the audience, you have given us a start to this series of webinars. And I hope that the audience would appreciate that in the next 2 iterations, we expect that they will let their circles know that Diplomats Without Borders and the Caribbean Policy Consortium is willing and ready to ensure that we place on board the challenges for a mission of peace and security, not only in the Caribbean, but internationally. Thank you so much, and all the best to all of you. Oh, could the panelists stay online for a photo shot? And there is Jessica Yang, and there is Leonie. Okay, so if we can have a photo shot, Jessica, can you do that?
All right, ready? Say cheese.
Yes.
All right, perfect.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Leonie.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Leonie. Thank you, Roberta, Ivlo.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks very much.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Jessica.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
It was a
Bye.
pleasure.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Jessica, I'm going to be in Grenada next week. Why don't you come over?
In
Who,
where?
me? Which
Yeah,
Jessica
Jessica.
you mean?
Jump.
Which
Take your private. Take your Jessica Byron.
No,
Take your private jet.
It's so confusing.
Jessica, we have to give you a trip to the Caribbean sooner
Oh,
or later.
please. Can Diplomats Without Borders sponsor me there?
Yes, all right.
I'll explore options.
All righty.
Mhm.
Thank
But
you.
only
Take
on
care.
the condition I can come along.
Yes, okay.